It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Mike R., North Hollywood, California.
Thank you. Thank you. I was just sitting and while looking out at you good folks here, I was thinking about, there's a couple of fellows here I don't think are too happy with me. They had to give up their golf game to come hear me talk today. And what they don't know is I'd just soon be out there playing golf. You know. That's him. You can't hear me? I can hear you. You'll hear me. That I promise. I want to thank the committee for inviting me to participate and take part in this conference. It's always good to be invited someplace. I want to thank a couple of them personally from, like Adriel S. and Jack B., of my friend Ralph M., who took care of the golfing program, and it's just been wonderful. I'm Mike Ross, and I'm an alcoholic. Like my friend Harold said last night, in some parts of the country, it's true, they don't, if you don't tell them what your sobriety date is, they feel you don't have one. And that happened to me the first time I went to, I was invited to Texas and Louisiana, and of course, I'd never given any sobriety date because, as a matter of fact, I hadn't gone to a convention for years. And I heard this, and it made a little sense to me. And so just to let you know that I do have a sobriety date, I haven't had a drink or smoked any pot, dropped any pills, stuck anything in my arms or anything else since the 8th day of May, 1948, and for that I'm most grateful. Thank you. I don't say that to impress you. It impresses me. I have never done anything that constant in my life. And if they had told me when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous that I wasn't going to take a drink for a year and a half, I'd have told them they were crazy. I am thankful for the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm thankful for what it's given me, and I'm thankful for what it's taken away from me. I come from a family of 4 sons. I'm the oldest. And we were raised in a small town in the state of Virginia. And I was the one that wound up a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I'm sure that when I was a young man going to school, that if someone had asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I didn't want to be an alcoholic and be a member of this society. But anyway, that's how it goes. I'd like to do something, if you don't mind. I would like to find out, is there anyone here today who is attending their very first Alcoholics Anonymous conference or convention? Would you raise your hands? Oh. Is there anyone in the audience with less than 30 days of sobriety? To all of you folks who have never attended a conference before, and those of you who have less than 30 days of sobriety, I want to welcome you on a journey that I know you'll never regret. It's been a journey for me that I know that I've had a lot of good feelings, laughed a lot, cried a lot, but it's a beautiful journey. And as our book of experience tells us, in the black lines it says that in a vision for you to join us as we trudge this happy road of destiny. And if you take the word trudge apart, Trudge, that stands for try relaxing under damn grim experiences. I drank for well over 20 years. Had my first arrest when I was 16, thrown in a drunk tank, and being lazy, headed for the bottom bunk, and I never did that again. In those days, I seemed to learn much quicker than I do today. I think I had all the necessary equipment to become a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because from a very early age, for one thing, I never wanted to work. And I don't know, down in North Hollywood, we have a lot of people that when you talk about work at an AA meeting, they seem to just get up and walk out, you know. They don't want to hear about it. But in my early days, I had a lot of grandiose ideas. And that's a hallmark of the alcoholic. At least it was for me. And so at an early age, I decided that since I wasn't too, thrilled with hard work, I decided I wanted to go into show business and become an actor. And I really didn't have any particular qualifications for that. As a matter of fact, after I got in the business, I used to hear him point at me and say, "See that fellow over there? He's got more guts than talent." And I proved it. Stuck around a long time. But I went in the show business, became an actor, and that was something I wanted to do. And I did it. And of course, the reason I did it was various. It wasn't because that I had a lot, as I said, I had a lot of talent. I found out later I did have talent. And it was just one of those things. But I went into it because it was glamorous. And I wanted to be on stage. And I wanted the lights on me. And I wanted to tell the funny jokes. And I wanted the people to laugh. You know, I came to AA and I found my story in the big book. How the hell did they know about me? I'll never know. But I wanted to be the center of attraction. And I worked in the world of entertainment for a lot of years. As a matter of fact, I'm still in it. And I started drinking early. I had my first drink when I was 13. And as I say, I had my first drunk arrest at 16. And when I drank, I liked what booze did for me. Because it took away all the fear and insecurity that was in here. You see, when I was 13, 14, and 15, I was almost as tall as I am now. And of course, the other kids around that were my age, they were much smaller than me, and I knew there was something wrong. Intellectually, I knew it. Emotionally, I didn't. And I always I could never understand why there was this big difference in me and them. And I figured out also early that I was going to have to do a lot of explaining about my actions, and that I would probably be a loser. And here again, that was not emotional. Because we'd have fights as kids doing the block, and we'd have a fight, and sure enough, as quick as I'd knock a little kid down, some neighbor would come by and see me, and they'd report to my family and say, "Look at that big bully picking on that little kid." How if the little kid got in a lucky punch and knocked me down, the other ones would say, "Hey, let's all jump him, he can't fight." When I started drinking, the drink made me fit into any group. It didn't make any difference. I went to New York City, and I went to New York City, and I worked to be an actor. I went into these little theaters they had in those days. And I became a part of it. And yet I wasn't. And so I noticed that the other fellows drank and I drank, and when I drank I felt a part of every group. I was very fortunate, very lucky, and I had a modicum of success in my early days as an actor. Now, I'm sure if I hadn't mentioned today that I was an actor, you people never would have known it. And if you stay up late at night, and you watch those late movies, you might have seen somebody in one of them that looked like me, and I might look familiar. But I just like to let you know that there are times today when I am gainfully employed. I went around doing my work and drinking. And as everything progressed, my drinking progressed. I got so drunk when I was with the show. I'll tell you this, share this with you. And it was in 1937 1941, that Pearl Harbor Day. And I was with the show, and we were on a train going from Cincinnati to Detroit. We were going to open an engagement in Detroit, Michigan. And we heard the news on the radio, and I got to Detroit. We got drunk on the train, we were mad and drunk, and got off the train, and the first thing I did was try to enlist. And the people there in Detroit said, "We can't take you unless you get a release from your draft board." And my draft board was in New York City. And so that made me a little bit madder, and I got a little bit drunker, What are you going to do? Anyway, we left Detroit and went to finish the show, went to Washington, D.C., and I was in Washington. And by this time, my drinking had gotten pretty good. I would do these things that I would only do under the influence of alcohol. And it hadn't gotten me to the point where I was sick. I was one of those kind of people that you hear about every once in a while, and I'd get sick, but the minute it was over with, I was ready to drink again. No big problem, So I was in Washington with this show, and I had a fight with the stage manager on a Friday night show. I went out Friday night and got bombed. And Saturday had a matinee to do, and past the bus station in Washington, a big sign, "Uncle Sam wants you." And I staggered in. Not staggered, I kind of weaved in there. There's a fellow sitting at the desk, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "I think I'll join up." And we had a little conversation, and I was getting a little loud, and trying to explain to him I couldn't go that day. I'd have to wait a couple of weeks. And the captain came out, wanted to know what the noise was about, and I told him I was with this show, and I have a contract, and I have to give 2 weeks' notice. And the captain said, "Fine." He said, "We'll take care of that." And he said, "We'll expect you back here in 2 weeks." He said, "However, you'll have to get a release from your draft board." And I said, "I'll take care of that." And that was Saturday. So we didn't have a show on Sunday. And so Saturday night after the show in Washington, D.C., I'm sorry, I'm missing the whole point. I went to the show Saturday noon, and I got a hold of the stage manager, and I said, tapped him on the shoulder, and he turned around. And I looked at him and I said, "Smitty, you can take the show and the scenery and the props and shove them up your heart." I said, "I quit." He said, "You can't quit." I said, "I've just quit. You've gotten 2 weeks' notice," and I left. I went to the dressing room, and here's another one of the miracles of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was dressing with one of the stars of the show, who was later to become a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, who was here before I got here. And we always had a fifth of scotch on a dressing room table, and walked in and poured a belt of scotch and had a little belt of it. And I looked at Eddie and I said, "I've got 2 more weeks and I'm leaving the show." And he said, "What do you mean?" And I told him what happened. By this time, a lot of havoc had been going on out with the company manager, and they all came back and tried to talk me out of it. And I said, "No, I'm leaving." I said, I'm going in the service. Now, I didn't tell him I enlisted because that wouldn't hold up. That's all I said. I hopped the train Saturday night, went to New York, called one of my brothers, spent the night with him Sunday night. Monday morning, bright and early, I'm down at the draft board, and I got my release and back to Washington for the show. Took the release over. 2 weeks later, I went back to Washington, and I was one of those people you could talk into anything. On a train going back from New York to Washington, I sat down next to a man in the airport, in the signal corps. And we got to talking. He said, "You going to service?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, that was one of the things that made me enlist. I was 6 feet 4.5 inches tall, and we're playing to audiences with GIs, and we were playing hospitals. And I had the feeling that every time I came out on the stage to do something, somebody or several of them in that audience was saying, "Why isn't that big so-and-so out here with us?" Did you ever get that feeling that everybody was talking about you? And that's one of those things, and I just felt that as big as I was, maybe that's where I should be. And so I got back, and they gave me a little going-away party on the show, and I came back on this train. I sat down next to this officer in the signal corps, and we got to talking. I told him I was going to enlist. He said, "What branch are you going into?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "You look like a pretty bright young fellow." He said, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "Well, I'm an actor. I've worked in radio, and I'm in a show in Washington." He said, "Well, you ought to join the Signal Corps. It's the brains of the Army." I said, "Okay," and I thought about that. So when I went back and I signed it, he said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "The Signal Corps. It's the brains of the Army." And he sent me to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. And they give you the test, and they had us all in a big auditorium like this, and had a cheap Victrola playing a record with dots and dashes. And they said, as they play, figure out the dots and dashes, and we did. And having good hearing, and I could distinguish between a dot and a dash, I got about a 97% right, and they said, "Why, fine, you're going to be a radio man." And I thought about a radio man. I said, I have enough trouble turning a radio on and off if the button ain't marked, But that's another story. Anyway, I went into the service, and I put in 5 years overseas in China, Burma, and India, and came back here. And by this time, my drinking was going pretty good. As a matter of fact, if the American public knew what we were doing over in China, Burma, and India, they'd have bought Japanese war bonds. I came back, and now that I'm back, I was released from the service, and I'm very nervous. I'm very nervous because now I've got to find my niche in show business. And I really haven't left the niche. But, I knew there was one there for me. At any rate, I got back into the business, and I began working with the man. I came to California in 1947. I came to California, and I was working in a nightclub down in L.A., staying at a hotel, and I ran into a fellow there one day, and he was glad to see me, a fellow I hadn't seen in years. And he said, "How are you?" And he said, "You're looking well. Let's go across the street and have a cup of coffee." And I said, "Fine." We went across the street and had a cup of coffee, and he started telling me about all of his friends and what they were doing, and I said, "That's nice." And we left. He left, and I went back to the hotel, went to the bar, had a couple of shooters, went back up to the room, and got cleaned up to go to work. Well, the rest of that week, no matter what time I got back to the hotel, he just happened to be passing by. He said, "How are you?" I said, "Fine. Let's go across the street and have a cup of coffee." And about the third day, I began thinking, this fellow's drinking an awful lot of coffee. He ain't offered to buy me a drink yet. Now, I know he drinks because I saw him pull him off a stage one night in a big theater in Washington, D.C., and he was drunk, and he told the same joke twice. And when the people didn't laugh the second time, he cussed them out. So I knew he drank. And Friday night, he pulled the trigger. He said, "You're off on Sunday nights. How would you like to go to see how some of your friends are doing?" And he told me about these people I knew who had joined, who had a meeting called Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said, "You won't believe it, but they're not drinking anymore." And I said, "No kidding." And he said, "Yeah." He said, would you like to go see him? I thought to myself, this is a phenomenon I would like to see, you know. And so Sunday he picked me up and we went to the old Masters Club in Hollywood, and we walked up these steps, and they had an old fella at the door by the name of Morrison, and he had a nose that made W.C. Fields look like a beaut, and he had all the wrinkles you could think of, and he shook my hand. He said, welcome, glad to have you here, and his wife was there with him. And he said that was his wife, and I didn't think he'd even think about it. And later on, when I got to know him better, they were two of the most beautiful people I'd ever met in my life. Anyway, we went into this room, and I looked around. Here's 50 or 60 men sitting there, and they all looked pretty good. And it's smoking and talking and drinking coffee and sitting around, and God, the smoke was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I turned to and being a fellow with a weird sense of humor, I turned to my friend. He said, doesn't anybody inhale in here? You know, it's... So anyway, I said hello to these people and sat down. And I must tell you about this meeting because there is so much about my beginnings in AA that enabled me later to get through a lot of adversity. There are a lot of things that I had to do myself. This meeting was being led by a little fellow, and he was a Spaniard, an actor, and he played Italian parts. His name, he's dead now, and he was a wonderful member of Alcoholics Anonymous. His name was Louis Alberni. And Louis spoke broken English, and he would open the meeting. And he did this night. He opened the meeting. He said, good evening. He said, welcome to the Alcoholics Anonymous group. And he told a couple of bad jokes. And these friends of mine started laughing. And I thought, this is terrible. I said, I think these guys got here 2 quarts too late. They were laughing at these bad jokes. And I just sat there and I thought, well, you know, it's good they got a place to go, keep them off the streets. And then he got through with, they read the 12 steps, which is all they had then. And then he introduced the speaker. Now, the speaker turned out to be a milkman. And I sat there and I said, what am I doing listening to a milkman, you know? Here, actors, I said, this guy is going to work when I'm staggering home. And in the course of this milkman's talk, he mentioned about getting up one morning, and he wasn't in too good a shape, jumped in a milk truck and drove to Phoenix, Arizona, and everybody laughed. And again I said, man, they're not wrapped too tight. What's so funny about a fella going to Phoenix? Maybe he got friends there. I don't know, you know. And when I left that meeting, I was convinced that my friends belonged where they were, but it wasn't for me. Now, there was another reason why it wasn't for me. Most of these men were at least 25 to 35 years older than I was. And they were neat and they were clean, you know. We didn't have any young people. We didn't have any people, when I came into AA, that looked like some of you people look today, you know. And so I felt kind of bad about that. And I felt, well, you know, they're where they ought to be, but I don't know why my friend wanted me to come here. But I did him the favor, and then later on I left. After that, I went out of town, and I was to have my last drunk on the Derby week in Louisville, Kentucky. As I mentioned earlier, I woke up on the morning of May the 8th, and I wasn't in my own hotel room, and I didn't know the person that was with me, and I had to drive to Cleveland, and it's bad enough driving to Cleveland, Ohio sober, you know. I'd rather have driven there drunk, and I was about half drunk when I woke up. And made this long drive to Cleveland, and I got to Cleveland, and I was in terrible shape. And I was shaking, and I was sick, and I had a bottle in my valise, my suitcase. And to this day, I can't tell you why I didn't open that bottle. Took it up to the hotel room. And I thought, my God, it was Sunday, and I said, if I could only be at that meeting tonight in Hollywood to have for those drunken actors, maybe. I didn't know there was AA anywhere else, folks. I could have fallen halfway down. I could have fallen down and been halfway to where it all started in Akron. But I didn't know that. All I could think of was the Maskers Club in Hollywood. And so the next 5 weeks were absolutely murderous. I was sober, just, on the wagon. I came back to California, and I called my friend, and I said, I'm back in town, and I'd like to know if I can go with you Sunday night to that meeting. And this was a Wednesday night. And he laughed, and he said, when do you get back? I told him when I got back, and he laughed. He said, you don't have to wait till Sunday. He said, just a minute. He got off the phone, he came back. I know what he was doing now. He went to get his meeting book. And he said, where are you? And I said, Santa Monica. He said, there's a meeting at such and such, and it'll start at 8:30, and he said, I'll see you later at the club. And hung up. And so I went to this meeting on a Wednesday night. It was in June, in July. And walked up and down in front of this American Legion Hall, and I was watching people go in, and I'm smoking cigarette after cigarette, and pretty soon I walk in, and I sit right down the last row, and there were wooden benches there, and there were people sitting up in front of me, and I sat down and lit a cigarette and kind of looked, and as the meeting started, a young fellow got up and started the meeting. 3 fellows came in and sat down on the side of me, and I thought, that's strange. There's a lot of empty benches up there. And while I was thinking about that, 3 more came in and sat down on this side of me. I got to think, well, wait a minute, maybe these 6 fellows are like me. Somebody sent them here too. I don't know. And I must tell you the condition I was in that night at that meeting. Number one, I was in a terrible condition physically and mentally. I went to that meeting with a lot of arrogance and hatred, resentment. I was a violent person in many ways. I hated my mother because I felt I'd become a victim of a disease called my son, my son. I wasn't too crazy about the dame I was married to. She was number 2 on the list. As a matter of fact, I really didn't have too much to do with the rest of the women in the world. Wasn't too crazy about them. And as a matter of fact, I remember that after I was in Alcoholics Anonymous for a while, I said to my sponsor, I said, I don't understand the feelings I had about women. I really didn't like them, didn't trust them, was afraid of them. I said, I don't understand how come I married 3 of them. He said, well, that's very simple to explain, Mr. Ross. He said, you were trying to get even with them. I hadn't heard these next words yet. I was to hear them many times, though, and I've heard them many times since. I'd never heard the words that God in his infinite wisdom works in mysterious ways. But that night, God was working in his mysterious manner, because the main speaker that night was a little slip of a girl. And as she was introduced and got up to speak, my thoughts were, what can she tell me about drinking? I said to myself, I probably threw up more than she drank. And she started to talk, and in her talk she mentioned the fact that she was a slipper, and I didn't know what she was even talking about. And that she'd come to Alcoholics Anonymous and gotten sober, and it was just wonderful, and she'd gone back to church, and everything was just fine. And then something happened, and she got drunk. And when she got drunk, she had a lot of tears and cried because she couldn't go back to church in that condition. And so she came back to Alcoholics Anonymous and got sober again, and she told the story twice. And I was beginning to get a little sick. And I said, God, if she tells it again, I'm going to get the hell out of here. And she started that story again, and I stood up and I said, excuse me. I found it. He said, sit down. So I sat down. And this little lady is rattling on, and I thought, well, I'll try this side. And I waited a minute or two, And I stood up, I said, excuse me, he said, sit down. So I sat down. And I thought about this for a minute, and I said, I'm going to get out of here. And a quick way would be if I shoved my finger down my throat. But I remembered my sponsor saying that the meetings were over at 10 o'clock. Now, I said sponsor because this man later became my sponsor. He was my friend then. And I looked at my watch, it was 9:30, and I said, okay, I'll wait another 30 minutes. And I looked at my watch 30 minutes later, and it was still 9:30, and I said, you know. The meeting was finally over, we stood up, and a little fellow stood up, he said, are you Mike? And I said, yes. And he said, I'm Roy. I said, how are you? And he introduced me to the other 5 men. He said, Larry sent us up here to bring you down to the club. Now, when he said club, and this is ladies as well, and some of them had said that when they came in, they heard all the talk about love. They kind of equated love with sex. Well, when this fellow said club, I equated club with booze, and I am ready for a drink. And I said, let's go, you know. They did club with booze, and I am ready for a drink. And I said, let's go, you know. They took me down to the old 6300 Club, and as we walked in, this friend of mine was sitting at a round table, and at the top of his voice, you could have heard him for a mile, he called my name out loud, my full name. And he said, over here, I've been waiting for you. And I went over, and we shook hands, and we sat down, and there's some fellow sitting around there, and he introduced me to all of them. He said, you know Mike Ross, he's an alcoholic. I said, how are you? He said, you know Mike is an alcoholic, how are you? That night he must have introduced me to 50 or 60 people, always the same introduction. Say hello to Mr. Ross, he's an alcoholic. And then he leaned over across the table and he punched me in the chest. He said, you're not going to take another drink as long as you live. I said, get your finger out of my chest, you'll give me cancer. I said, I'll do anything you say, only quit punching. But that's what he said. He said, you're not going to take another drink as long as you live. That was the end of the sentence. That was my beginning in Alcoholics. That was my introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous. That was my introduction to what I feel today as the greatest society of men and women to have ever had the good fortune to be associated with. And that night started the rejuvenation, if you will, or the rebirth of Mike Ross. Now, he told me a lot of other things in the course of the next 2 or 3 nights. For example, he said to me, I want you to sit down and shut up and listen. He said, I don't want you talking behind any podiums or reading any 12 steps or leading any meetings. And I said, why not? And he said, you got nothing to say. And I said, but suppose I want to ask some questions. He said, do it around the table here. This is enough for you. And then there was a couple other fellows there from one of the other groups who were known as the Hole in the Ground group. Now, in those days, they didn't have any of those slogans that we have today, like live and let live, easy does it. Yeah, I never knew what easy did anyway, you know. You ever tried getting drunk easy? Can't do it. Easy does it, and let go and let God. And then somebody, some dummy, thought up of one that I can't understand and never will. They got one called Think, Think, Think. And I said, the fellow that got that sign up must still be drinking. But we didn't have any of those signs. They had 2 little things that they said. They were very There were, you couldn't misunderstand what they meant because there were simple language, simple words. I just mentioned one of them. It said, sit down, shut up, and listen. And the other one was, if you were a newcomer, they'd look at you and say, if your mouth is open, you're lying. And if any of you have analytical minds, try analyzing those two. I didn't know that I was started on a journey that was to bring everything good that's ever happened to me into my life. Meet people from all over the world, and associations, friendships. But it took me a little longer than most people. I remember I was sober about 3 or 4 weeks, and I said to my friend one night, I said, I understand you got a book in AA, but it costs $3.50 and I don't have any money. And he said, you don't need the book, I'll tell you what to do. He was worried about my borrowing money from him because I didn't have a job. I not only didn't have a job, I was married, I had a son 6 months old, and I was living on $20 a week GI unemployment insurance. The rent was $75 a month, and the kids' formula was $9 a week. And when I said to my friend, I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I said I had to turn down a job. He made me turn down a job that was offered to me to go into a show in San Francisco. And we talked about it, and we drove home to where I lived this one night, and, I guess I'd been sober 4 or 5 months. And I said, I got to take the job. He said, no, you don't. Now, we drove to my place. He said, let's sit down and have a cup of coffee. So we went into the kitchen. I had 2 apple boxes and pulled out the breadboard. Oh, we didn't have any furniture. And he and I sat on the 2 apple boxes, had the coffee on the breadboard, and he gave me all the reasons why I couldn't go back to work for this fella and go back in the show business up there. He said, this is where you belong. So I said, but I can't pay that. He said, don't worry about it. I said, but I can't. He said, don't worry about it. And after don't worry about it for about 2 hours, I thought, I wonder if I dare ask him to lend me $25. And I knew that would be a mistake, so I didn't ask him. But I didn't go to San Francisco and join the show either. I stayed in Los Angeles. I began going to meetings, and I finally got a big book. I got one of those old red buckram books. And I suppose I began to read that big book the way most new people read the book. Read a little bit, turn a page, read a little more, turn another page. And that's the way I read it, except one thing happened to me. I read that foreword. At that time, it was only the one foreword. And that foreword stated that we are 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, and to show you, and these were in big letters, precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. And I said to myself right then and there, how about that? That's the way they do it. They don't play this by ear. You don't do it the way Charlie and Sam and Max did it. You do it exactly as it says in the book. And I read that thing, and I thought that was great. And then I got to chapter 3, and I read that first paragraph in chapter 3, where it tells us that many of us refuse to admit that we're real alcoholics. We refuse to believe that we can't drink like our fellows, and we have this illusion. And that the persistence of this illusion will lead us into the gates of insanity or death. And I said, damn, that's heavy, and I turned the page. Turned the page, and for a long time missed one of the greatest lines that was in the book. And finally, I was about 7 or 8 months sober, and I began reading that. I read that chapter again. I started with that paragraph. My eyes fell down to the next line. And the next line stated, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we are alcoholics, and this is the first step in recovery. And I said, holy smokes, these people got 2 first steps and don't know it. And I said, as soon as my sponsor lets me talk, I'm going to tell him about it. Now do you know why he didn't want me to do any talking for a year? Oh, my goodness. Well, God foiled me again. In about my 9th month, I went to a meeting, and a fellow by the name of Chuck C. was talking. And Chuck got to talking, and all of a sudden Chuck said, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we're alcoholics. And this is the first step in recovery. And I sat there and I said, you dirty so-and-so, you stole my line. Because I wanted to tell you people we got 2 first steps and nobody's been talking about it. That was my condition in my first year in Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I stand before you today and I'm thinking about all the things that have happened to me. Having the good fortune to know a lady like Alabama who spoke here Friday night and know her for 26, 27 years. And have the pleasure and privilege of being a member of the Board of Advisors at the North Hollywood Group, which is my home group, and it's the best damn group in Alcoholics Anonymous. And if you don't feel that way about your home group, you better get another home group. People like Alabama and people like Harold, who spoke last night, and many others. I've met some wonderful people here in Stockton. Ralph M., and Jack B., and his lovely wife Nadine, Mary Lynn. And you know, we have people who have never met before, and yet we have a common bond. We have a common bond in that we're all here trying to do the same thing. We're sitting here today as recovered members of Alcoholics Anonymous, recovered alcoholics. Now, I say I'm a recovered alcoholic because the book tells me so. And the book only speaks the truth. And the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous literally saved my life. Because I became a book reader after I got sober. Oh, I read books before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, Captain Billy's Whiz Bang, and those kind of books. But for me, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous literally became a Bible. I found unadulterated truths in that book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there isn't a line in that book that you can refute or question. I read the doctor's opinion and Bill's story. And you know, it was amazing. After I read Bill's story several times, I found out that almost the first 10 steps are in Bill's story, and I never knew that. And I began to find out other things. And I have to tell you this, since we're speaking of truths, I really wouldn't have given my first 10 years of sobriety to my worst enemy. Because I wasn't a very loving person. You know, I didn't go to birthday parties. I didn't go to conventions. I didn't go any of those places. As a matter of fact, I remember I was invited to a birthday party, and someone said, "You're going to Sarah's birthday party." I said, "How old's Sarah?" She said, 1 year old. I said, "I don't go to 1 year old birthday parties." And people would invite me. I must tell you about my first birthday. When I was 1 year sober, it was at the motion picture group again. And Louis Alberni is the leader again. And Louis got up to lead the meeting, and before he got into the meeting, after the steps were ready, he said, "Tonight," he said, "we have a birthday." He said, "Ross is 1 year sober." He said, "Stand up, Ross." And I stood up. He said, "Sit down. That's enough." That was the end of the birthday. You know. would like to tell you that I did all those things that I was supposed to do. I did. I washed the cups, and I hated the lipstick on the cups. I used to break them to keep from washing them. You know, I've got to tell you how it was in the early days. As I said before, we didn't have people that looked like you when I came in. My last sponsor, who passed away the first day of May, Eddie R., and my original sponsor and myself were the three youngest members of Alcoholics Anonymous in Southern California in 1948. So we had maybe 6 women, mostly men, about 6 women, and all the women had to be 55 or 60. And I couldn't understand what they wanted in their age. You know, they were over the hill anyway. Just keep on drinking, kid. Don't let it get away now. But I got to tell you, I'm grateful that they didn't go back out and drink, because God bless them, Polly Hall, Carolyn Boozer, Effie Simpson. A lot of these ladies were able to help me save my life. They did save my life on many occasions. They sat me down and talked to me like a Dutch uncle. Well, Polly Hall, you know, is to the people that were there. And when a fellow said that when I got here I had no place else to go, you knew it. All you had to do was look at him and smell him. He really had no place else to go. And they came in, if they had a wristwatch, the fellow would say, wristwatch out. You haven't lost everything yet. Little did they know that you would come in here, that we would have people coming into Alcoholics Anonymous having lost families and homes and jobs and whatever, having lost their self-respect. And that was something I had lost, was my self-respect. And because of God's grace, it's been returned to me. And I try to treat it gently. But I had a problem in Alcoholics Anonymous. I would hear people talk about the love in these meetings, and I never felt it. I must tell you that I was sober 22 years before I attended my first convention of Alcoholics Anonymous. And once again, God had come into my life, because I was in Houston, Texas on business. And my business associate was married to a woman in Alcoholics Anonymous who was having a little problem. And that particular week there was going to be a Texas State Convention. And they told me about it. And I said, well, what kind of convention? They said, Alcoholics Anonymous. And I said, oh. And her husband said, well, we'll go down and register. And I didn't know what to say. And I thought, how do I tell them I don't go? You see what God does to us kids? And so we went down to the Shamrock Hotel, and they registered. And as they registered, there was long tables out there in the lobby. And I'm walking along, and on the tables they got all kinds of things. They got cigarette lighters, and they had all kinds of pins. They had praying hands and kneeling knees, and you know, whatever you could think of that had AA on it, or the Serenity Prayer, or whatever. And I looked at a flyer, and here were 4 people that were going to be the main speakers there. And they were good friends of mine, Chuck and Elsa C. and Lorraine and Eddie C. And I turned, and they were walking down the corridor. And to this day, we don't know who was the most surprised to see each other. Me see them, or they see me. Because Eddie came up and threw his arms around me. He said, what are you doing here? This is a convention. I said, I don't know. We've laughed about that for a lot of years since. That 25th annual Texas State Convention in Houston, Texas in June 1970 turned my life around. I went to a meeting on Thursday night, and at that meeting a man by the name of Wesley P. from Pompano Beach, Florida was a speaker. And the lights were turned down in that room, and the room was full. I would imagine they had about 500 people in that room that night. It was the night before the kickoff meeting. And as Wesley talked and I sat there and listened, pardon me, I began to notice that there were tears, and I was crying. Now, I hadn't cried at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. And I couldn't tell you why I was crying that night. I didn't know. But there was a feeling in that room that I had never felt before. And when the meeting was over, and I was wiping my eyes, I met Wesley. I introduced myself to him, and I told him, I said, I don't know what you said, but I only have to tell you that tonight I felt something in this room I've never felt before. And I said, I've cried for the first time at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and I said, I've been sober 22 years. And he put his arms around me, and he said to me, after a few words, he said, Michael, did it occur to you that possibly tonight you have found a way to love yourself? And because of that, you were able to feel the love around you. I didn't miss a meeting at that convention. And Sunday, everybody was scurrying around, and I said, where's everybody going? They said, we're going home. I said, how come? They said, the convention's over. I said, well, when's the next one? They said, next June. I said, where? They said, Fort Worth. I said, I'll be there. They said, we'll look for you. They must have thought I was crazy. And I came back to California, to North Hollywood, and I didn't tell a soul I'd been to a convention. Couldn't afford to spoil my image, you know. And I couldn't wait till next June. And by golly, I had an operation on my knee in March of that year, or March of that year. And I told the doctor, I said, look, I got to be able to go to Fort Worth, Texas. I got to be there in June. And he said, well, you may be on crutches. I said, I don't care, but I got to be there. He said, okay. And I went to that convention in June of 1971, and I was on crutches. And you know, these people saw me. And so what happened? I thought, we were glad, and they hugged me, and they kissed me, and they were, well, I couldn't get over it. I'd never met these people before a year ago and hadn't seen them in a year. And that was new to me. Completely new. And I came back from that convention, and I went down to see my sponsor, Eddie. And I said, Eddie, I got something to tell you. He had a stationery store, printing shop. And he was behind the counter. I said, he said, how are you, friend? I said, fine. And I said, I just got back from Texas. I said, I've been to a convention. He said, that's good. And he never looked up. He was writing. And I said, I got to tell you. I said, I went to a convention last year, too, in Houston. He said, oh, that's nice. And I said to him, did you? I said, he said, oh, yeah, you went to 2 conventions. I said, right. I said, why didn't you tell me? And as I started to talk, he took his glasses off and dropped them in his apron pocket. He said, tell you what? I said, well, why didn't you tell me about these things? I said, what do I do now? I said, how do I make up for all these years that I've been acting like such a dummy? That I, poo-pooed all these things. And he looked at me and he said, friend. He said, what right do I have to deprive you of your pain and suffering? That was my sponsor. And strangely enough, as I went to meetings back in California, I began to feel the love there. I began to feel the love in those rooms. My favorite meeting, which is a Tuesday night beginners meeting at North Hollywood, and I'd been going to that meeting for years, all of a sudden I felt the love there. The love of my fellow man, the love that you and I share with one another, asking for nothing in return. Just to be able to put our arms around each other and say, we're glad to see you and we love you. And we want to know if everything is all right. And if it isn't, what can we do? What can I do? For the first time in my life, I found out what it means to be able to want to do something for somebody else, asking for nothing in return. not even their love. And for the first time in my life, too, if it's necessary to make an amends and not worry about the way he reacts to my amends, that's none of my business. But I do know this. I do know that with everything that I have read, everything that I have seen, I only know that God looks out for his kids, and we are his kids. I know Harold said it last night, and I have to repeat it again, especially for those of you who are new here today. And it's in our big book of Alcoholics Anonymous in the black lines, and there's a wonderful line that's printed there that states, "Cling to the thought that in God's hands your darkest past will become your dearest possession." And that we must, of a necessity, give up the masochism that we know how to practice so well. That we must remember that we are here as self-respected and self-respecting men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. This year has been a particularly bad year for me. Not only because of a little problem that I had and had to go to the hospital, but mostly because I lost my friend. Eddie Regan passed away on the first day of May. He was my sponsor. We had a friendship that went back 42 years, 11 years prior to coming into Alcoholics Anonymous. And 31 beautiful years in AA. And my life has been much enriched because of knowing Eddie. Eddie left a legacy in Alcoholics Anonymous. He was our token young person when we were new. He was a couple of years younger than me. He started the first 2040 group down there, which later became the young people's meeting. And the young people were always on his mind. And through him, and because of that, the young people became a part of my job, hopefully. Because the young people are the ones that are going to be here when we're gone, to carry on. And I only know one thing about Alcoholics Anonymous. I only know one way that this program works. And it works with one drunk talking to another drunk. Because it tells me so. That I am an alcoholic, and I am here to obtain and maintain my sobriety and be able to pass it on to someone else who still suffers. And I try to do so, asking for nothing in return, not even talking about it, because if you do, it doesn't count. That's what they told me. I am indeed a most fortunate person. I have my health. I have Alcoholics Anonymous. I have you people. And people like you that I've met all over the United States. People who, in the first time in my life when they said they loved me, I knew, for some reason, I knew they meant it. In the beginning, I didn't believe it, but later on, I came to find out they really loved me. And I didn't know why. Today, I'm in a real good place. Today, I feel I'm the most fortunate man in the world. Today, my cup runneth over, and I only hope I can carry it gently. I am not an expert on the disease of alcoholism, nor am I a counselor or a consultant. I'm merely an example, good, bad, or indifferent, of the results of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And for this, I am grateful. God bless you.